Good morning, and thank you very much to the Central Bank of Lithuania for inviting me here today to discuss pension policy challenges. So I was asked to, in addition to talk about pension policy issues per se, to go through possible future scenarios, what's going to happen to the population and macroeconomy. So I'll be covering both of these aspects over the coming half hour. Let's see. So we do a lot of work together with the member states, also with the Lithuanian authorities, to estimate possible effects of population aging on the labor market, on economic growth, and also on pension expenditure and other age-related expenditures. So I'll go through this now. We have a comprehensive framework into which we have incorporated also the longer-term considerations. We do a lot of analysis together with the council committees, the Ecofin council committees, to get to a common view on possible future scenarios for economic and fiscal developments. And in this context of work, we prepare aging reports which provide projections over the long term. This we prepare together with the authorities, and we are using it in the general coordination exercises in the Commission, which is surveillance of the budgetary positions, and also in the more general context of European semester coordination of economic policies. So one of the components to carry out this policy coordination is the aging reports, and the latest one we prepared this year, and it was published in May this year. It consists of 2 volumes. The first volume looks at the population prospects, which is a comparable, consistent projection by Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the EU. And also we look at the labor market and economic growth effects. Later on, together with the member states, we estimate the age-related expenditure costs, mostly on pension and healthcare, because pension is the biggest spending program there is of all of the government programs, generally speaking. So these reports, they are available. We put everything online. We put all of the Excel tables from the statistical annexes online, so every researcher and also national policymakers can download these data, see how their country compared to others, or look at the specific topic they're interested in, and can make cross-country comparisons on a comparable basis. So lots of information is available. In this presentation at the end, I've included links to all of this information. Okay, so the projection exercise is such that we look at, it's a stepwise approach. We start out with a common framework for population projections that is done by Eurostat, as I mentioned. We discuss with the member states. We estimate future developments for the labor force, for the labor market. We discuss the productivity assumptions so that we get an economic baseline GDP projection. And once we have that, we need to have this economic base assumption, because we need to relate future expenditure on pension to something. But what if it goes to 1.5 million to 1.8 to 2 billion euros? If you don't relate it to GDP, you don't have a good feeling for what it actually means. Okay, and we also cover a lot of other expenditure programs. The most important ones are healthcare and long-term care. On average, together, these make up about 9% of GDP, those 2 programs together. Pension is the biggest. It's more like 11% of GDP in the EU, and in the Eurozone, it's even higher. So let me now turn to the population prospects. again, I'm unlucky because of different PowerPoint versions, so this doesn't work perfectly. So let me just skip to the end. So what we are seeing overall in the EU is that the size of the population in the base year, which was 2 years ago, 2016, and in the far future in 2070, it's more or less the same. But what is happening is that the structure of the population is changing very dramatically. So the size of the working age population is shrinking consistently, while the number of elderly people are increasing to the highest proportion ever observed. And the highest increase of all are those that are aged 80 and more in the far future by 2060, 2070. This is not so different from, for example, the United Nations population projections. It's not the same. The assumptions are a little bit different, and they are done at different points in time. But it's what most people expect in terms of the future trends in population. So what this then means is for the EU as a whole, that the dependency ratio, that is the number of persons, the conventional 65 number, which still persists to be the retirement age in a lot of countries, compared with those in the working force age 2064. It's almost doubling, going from almost 30% to almost 60%. And I've indicated here with an arrow to what is the situation for Lithuania. So it's increasing a little bit more than for the EU as a whole, and it also starts at a little bit lower than the EU. So the aging prospects are much more noticeable in Lithuania than in the EU average. This is, of course, due to the underlying assumptions. That is, there is little inflow of migrants at all in Lithuania. On the contrary, which is something that's been observed in the past, and fertility rates are currently lower than in many other countries. So that is why you get a stronger effect on the dependency ratios. If we look at the economic dependency ratio, there we see a similar phenomena, just that we start out from a much higher level, because previously we just looked at the purely on the size of the population per se. Here instead, we look at the inactive population above 65, which is pretty much the pensioners. We compare it not with the full population of 20 to 64, but those that are actually working. So therefore, we see that in the base year, it's more like 50%, the economic old age dependency ratio, and it is still increasing by about 20-25 percentage points on average. So this is the basic population projection background. Let's look more concretely on what are mostly relevant for economic growth prospects. So in this line, I'm showing you the top line, the top dotted line. That's simply the number of people of working age bracket 20 to 64, okay? So there we can see that the peak happened in 2011 for the EU as a whole. So since 2011, the number of persons in working age has been declining, and is estimated, projected to continue to decline throughout the entire projection horizon. Now, because of a recovery, a still ongoing recovery in the labor market, there is an increase in the employment rate, which is the yellow line. And this is, firstly, the increase in the employment rate is relatively strong for the next few years, and then it's quite moderate. It is actually increasing also over the longer term, and that might be puzzling for some of you. In fact, it's not puzzling at all. It is because almost more than half of EU countries now, they have legislated pension reforms that take effect into the future. No. And typically, and one of the most common one of those is to increase the retirement age at future dates. And because you increase the retirement age, you increase labor force participation, and you also increase employment. But despite the increase in the employment rates, the demographic factors are dominating, and by 2021, in the EU as a whole, also the number of persons employed start declining, and that continues throughout the horizon. Now, what you see for Lithuania is the lower bar, if you're able to see it, or otherwise you can look at the slides later on. It's the same pattern, but it's a bit graver, because the decline in the working age population is much more pronounced, firstly. There is a very strong recovery since the crisis of employment, and there is still an ongoing increase in the employment rate because of the increase of the retirement age that is coming to the EU mainstream of 65 eventually. But still, this entire process has already started in Lithuania, and there is a fall in the potential employment. I should point out that this is all based on a forecast that was done in the spring 2017. Not to alarm you too much, whenever we update the forecasts, we update all of this, and all analysis is consistently made on the last forecast. This is a snapshot of the projection that we had in the aging report that was based on the spring 2017 forecast. Okay, the next part you need then is what's going to happen to labor productivity. So this is the trickiest question of them all, I think, and there is deep divide as to what is going to be the dominant factors of the future. We had a conference just before the summer in Brussels. We also have Robert Gordon, who is one of the authorities on labor productivity research. A bit of a pessimist, in fact, but anyway, he has one view. There are others who are much, much more optimistic. What we have done as the baseline scenario in all of these assumptions is that we go back to an average TFP, or labor productivity growth rate, that's been observed over the last 20 years. So whatever are the so-called solar residual shocks that affected on average the economy in the past, we take it as a prudent baseline for the future. But the report importantly includes variation scenarios where we assume higher and lower productivity. So what is the effect then? The effect on growth are kind of self-evident. You assume higher labor productivity growth, what you get is higher potential GDP growth. But what is interesting is to see what the effect is of those assumptions on age-related spending programs. And that's all different, depending on how you design indexation schemes and so on for pension. The assumption is to go back to a total factor productivity growth rate of 1%, and that corresponds to a labor productivity growth rate of 1.5% over the long term. Of course, Lithuania, other countries that have experienced recent high growth, we allow for continuation of that for 20 years. So it's a convergence path down to a common growth rate in the far, far future. We also take account on the extent to which there is a catching up potential, measured then on the distance, how far away you are in terms of productivity levels. And the further away you are, the higher is the assumed productivity growth rate, consistent with typical convergence theories. Because what is much more important for more mature European economies is that even getting to 1% TFP or 1.5 productivity growth rate seems almost like utopia, at least for some continental European economies. So we also include and analyze a lot a risk scenario, according to which we assume convergence to lower productivity, labor productivity growth rate of 1.2%. So we put all of this together then, and then what we are ending up with on average in the EU is pretty stable growth between 1 and 1.5% ever since the crisis. So the good news then is that there is positive real growth also in the future. The trick is that it's much, much lower than most European countries have been used to for a long time. So it's trickier to do policies in a low growth environment than in a high growth environment. I showed you the EU, which is interesting, but it's not a country. It's an average of 28 member states. There's huge variation across the countries. Here's the arrow on Lithuania. It's quite interesting. But as I said before, labor productivity growth has been very strong over the last decade and still is. We allow for it to continue for another 10, 15, up to 20 years. That's why productivity is supporting growth a lot. On the other hand, as we saw before, there was one of the heaviest declines in the working age population projected for Lithuania. Therefore, there is negative labor growth. So GDP growth is not that high, in fact, unless policies change based on this type of population projections and based on this type of pension legislation. Okay, let me now turn to the fiscal impact of aging. Overall, in the EU, it's quite modest compared with previous updates of the aging report. Overall, it's projected to rise from total age-related spending. It's projected to rise from 25% to almost 27% over the long term in the baseline scenario. If we assume, which is relevant for a lot of continental European economies, is lower productivity growth, and there we get a higher increase over the long term, fully channeled through higher pension expenditure, so more like 28%. And finally, what is the biggest risk scenario is that if we assume much more dynamic expenditure of healthcare, because the baseline scenario captures exclusively the demographic impact on future healthcare expenditure, while if we actually analyze past behavior in healthcare spending, the demographic factor is not the most important one, but there are technological progress and general income effects are much more important factors for healthcare. So if we incorporate some of those components, then we're ending up with an increase of about 4% of GDP over the long term. So this is the average for the EU. An increase in the baseline of just about 2 percentage points of GDP. Quite modest. How can it be so modest? I'll come to this shortly when we analyze a bit more in detail pension expenditure. That's where it comes from, apart from the factor I just mentioned that healthcare expenditure, the base scenario incorporates demographic aspects exclusively, thus not including technological progress factors. But Lithuania is very low in total. This is because of pension expenditure in the baseline is projected to decrease over the long term. But as you can see, the variety is absolutely enormous. And the main reason for it in the baseline scenario is pension expenditure. And it is because we are incorporating all reforms that were in place at the time of the cutoff, which was in the December 2017. So all legislated measures to pensions up until that point are included. So on the one extreme, you got Luxembourg with a projected increase of almost 15 percentage points of GDP. Almost all of it is because of pension expenditure. And on the other extreme, you got Greece, which has now done a whole string of pension reforms where the Troika has assisted the Greek authorities. And anyway, now they have ended up at a decline. So this then incorporates the multitude of reforms they have taken ever since 2010. So this then is what you would expect if there are no further changes in policy. If you change policy, you change the expenditure trends, obviously. So this is something that, why it's useful to redo these exercises every 3 years. We redo it every 3 years, so we can take account, you know, partly new policies that have been put in place, and also partly because of new outturn data, new evidence on population and economic growth factors. As I said, I mean, the most important factor, if we assume that all pension systems do not change any more than how they were designed in late 2017, the most important challenge is that of healthcare. And both healthcare and long-term care, if we assume for healthcare, for example, that there is that the new medicines and the new treatments that are being discovered, they are incorporated and they are also financed through the public budget, then we'd see a much higher increase than in the baseline scenario. For long-term care, the scenario is such that we are looking at an expansion of coverage of long-term care, because as a matter of fact, at the moment, there are very few countries who are providing publicly wide provision for long-term care. So we are assuming an expansion of coverage, and we're assuming an expansion of the quality of the long-term care scenario. And also on this one then would be much, much more important component of age-related expenditure in the coming decades. Okay, the focus on pension. This one is a little bit tricky, but luckily I have a full half hour, so I can spend, I think, a full minute on this one. So this is a little thought experiment. If you look firstly at the top panel, you look at the blue graph, that shows you what would be the change in percentage points of GDP of pension expenditure if the only factor we consider is the demographic factor. Okay, so we assume that the system is, everything is frozen as it is. The only thing we are changing is that we are reducing the number of working age people over time, as the population projection does, and the number of workers, therefore. And we are increasing the number of pensioners in the future. So this is simply the dependency ratio effect. If that was the only thing that was happening, there were no pension reforms, there were no indexation formulas running or anything, the increase would be about 7 percentage points of GDP. But what we observe is instead an increase, firstly an increase and then a decrease. So the net result is the change in the far future is 0 percentage points of GDP. There are two factors that explain this. And the first factor is the benefit ratio effect. So that is pension benefits are increasing not as fast as wages. So the benefit ratio is simply defined as the average pension compared with the average wage. Now, if pensions were fully indexed to wages, this would be 1, you know, same indexation rate. The fact is that pensions are not indexed or valorized according to wages. This is one of the key reform channels that countries have been using over the last decade. Because of the reforms, these parametric reforms of indexation and valorization, this takes off about 4 percentage points of GDP. The other factor is the increase in the retirement age, and that is the red line. And the red line takes off about 3 percentage points of GDP because of legislated increases over time in the member states. You have a similar situation in Lithuania. The most important difference is that of the red line, the coverage ratio, is because the retirement age in Lithuania goes up to 65 in for both genders in like 10 years or more or less, and then it just stays there. While in most other countries, the retirement age is continuing to increase also after the age of 65, which is why the coverage ratio aspect can continue to subtract from the pure demographic effect. So that's why we end up with a change in the pension to GDP ratio of 0 long term. So these reforms, they work. But if policies change, notably affecting indexation or valorization, or affecting the retirement age, they will bounce back up again. This is in fact what we found in the latest aging report, because it's exactly what happened in the Czech Republic. Previously, they had an increase in the retirement age over the long term in line with life expectancy. And then the next government changed legislation, and they say, no, we will stay at 65 forever. So what they did was then move this red line up fully, so that they have a much higher liability going forward. Okay, let me look at the specificity of the Lithuanian example, because when we did the new aging report, we found out together with Lithuanian authorities that there is some room for improvement of the clarity of the pension law in Lithuania, because the reform of 2016 says that what you should do is that you should index and valorize pensions according to the wage sum, okay? But the law also includes a caveat in that if the pension benefit ratio falls, the government shall prepare a proposal for how to solve the situation. So we have here the baseline scenario, which assumes the wage sum indexation, which is fully compatible with the law. We also have two other scenarios. One scenario where we are looking at changes, we're looking at the total benefit ratio, so the combination of public and private pensions. And whenever there is a fall in the combined benefit ratio, then we switch to wage indexation, average wage indexation, because in this way you avoid the fall in the pension benefit ratio. In this case, we would not see a fall in pension to GDP in Lithuania any longer. It would end up slightly higher than in the base year after having increased a lot over the first part of the projection horizon. And the last scenario is if you look purely at the public pension benefit ratio, then you would in fact actually even see an increase, because then you would suspend the wage sum indexation rule pretty much throughout the entire horizon, because the public pension benefit ratios in the baseline projected to fall in almost every year. So there is then some policy uncertainty in Lithuania. The baseline scenario assumes the wage sum indexation, but the law asks for possible recalibration in a case of a fall in the benefit ratio. Okay, I'm now running out of time, so I think I'm going to skip forward a couple of slides to the remaining policy challenges. So what we can conclude, having done many of these aging reports and surveillance from the EU Commission level, is that there has been an enormous increase in the number of pension reforms. Firstly, around the year 2000, that's when a lot of people, and much of the good work Edward Palmer has been involved with, also with the OECD, started to put the attention on the future demographic trends and what's going to be the implications both for economic growth and provision of public pensions. So there was an increased intensity around 2000. Then when coinciding with the crisis, and the crisis is always a good reason to review a lot of things, or a good reason, it's a reason to review a lot of things, because you have to. But more seriously, also, as we saw, around 2010, 2011 was the defining moment when working age population actually starts to fall on average in the EU. So now it's not just something for pension for the future. Now it's also something that is starting to hit economic growth, potential growth. And in some countries, for example, like in Germany and Finland, who are early on in this cycle, it's been going on for many years already. So as a result, on the other side of the panel, you can see the aggregate evolution of pension to GDP expenditure projections. So originally rising by about 6 percentage points of GDP some 15 years ago. And you had the black line there at the bottom, which shows an increase up until 2040, and then a subsequent decline thereafter, due to reforms taking effect, also due to the pass-through in the system of the big so-called baby boom cohort. Okay, so it's been shown that it's possible to pass legislation to put pension systems on a sustainable path. Many countries have done it. On average, we are there. But there is enormous variety still in the EU. Luxembourg, on the one hand, which has an absolutely tremendous replacement rate that is expected, according to current legislation, to continue forever. It will cost a total fortune. On the other hand, you got Greece, projected decrease in the pension expenditure ratio. So according to the projections, Greece are going to end up at the average after many, many decades. For the moment, they are spending like 18% of GDP on pensions. There's long phasing in all of these reforms. This means that there are risks because there can be new policy decisions taken to alter the parameters of pension reforms. Still, the fact that the baseline current legislation is broadly compatible with sustainable systems, something that was absolutely not the case some 10, 15 years ago. So this is great progress. But there are many issues, reversals, intergenerational fairness issues. More needs to be done. One of the things that we are putting more emphasis now also with our colleagues in the Commission is to put more emphasis on pension adequacy and what are the channels through which pensions can be improved over time, because we have seen that there are some falls in pension benefit ratios over time. So what are the channels through which we can improve this while safeguarding sustainable systems? Finally, we need, of course, to be aware of what can be other political potential risks to the design of pension systems. So, for example, this is the median age of voters in the EU. We had stability for a long time. For like 30 years, it was pretty stable both for men and for women. We are not even halfway through to the transition of a much older population. And there's evidence of older persons being more prone to vote. And if they are not so altruistic, there are possibilities then that there will be further adjustments to pension policy issues, which is why this kind of reports are very important in order to try to avoid ducking the bill and pushing it down for future generations. Now, one way how to then look at what does being old mean? So if we do a little example here, we look at what we saw before, the dependency ratio of older persons defined as 65, which is the prevailing retirement age currently. Not everybody is there, but most are there. If we wanted to have the same dependency ratio in the far future, then we need to set old at age 74 and not at age 65, because in this way, on average in the EU, you get the same dependency ratio. So I said it's 74. If we look at the specific case of Lithuania, it would rather be 76, simply reflecting the fact of a higher increase of the older population segments and a larger decline of the working age population. Thank you very much for your attention.